All right, thank you, everybody, and welcome to a public meeting for the committee of the whole community development. Today is Monday, August 26th at 6 p.m. And we are in the council chambers in Spencerville. I'd like to call this meeting to order. And if you have not already done so, anybody who's in attendance has to sign the attendance form. So if we could make sure that you've signed that, that's great. And also, if you do have anything anybody wants to speak up to, please make sure people are aware of your name and so we can then make sure that's on the record as well. We can cover all that. So okay, so with that, I need an approval of the agenda. Do I have a mover? So moved by the Deputy Mayor Steve Bylaw and seconded by Joe Martel. All right, disclosure of pecuniary interest. Nope, yeah, I should call the vote probably. I'd like to call that to vote. All in favor? Okay, unanimous. Thank you very much. Okay, number 3, disclosure of pecuniary interest or conflict of interest or the general nature thereof. Does anybody have any to declare?
None here.
None by me, hearing none. Okay, that's good. Moving on to number 4, process and information. Okay, so on that note, I'd like to hand it over to the community development coordinator to introduce us to the topic tonight.
Thank you. So through the chair, today's meeting is a public meeting. It's hosted by our committee of the whole community development regarding a proposed housekeeping amendment for a zoning bylaw that was adopted in 2022. So the purpose of this meeting is to consider a proposed amendment to the zoning bylaw that's been initiated by the township. This is considered a housekeeping amendment. It's meant to correct or clarify provisions of the bylaw that have been identified by staff through their experience in working with the bylaw over the past 2 years. It also amends provisions and definitions related to additional residential units and amends the zoning schedules with respect to floodplain and in a few other areas of the schedule. So the public meeting was advertised in accordance with the requirements of the Planning Act. Because it's not a site-specific amendment, we didn't mail out notices to every property owner within 120 meters of the site as we normally would. There's an application, so we advertise it in the newspaper. So it's been advertised in the Brockville Recorder and Times, the Brockville and Prescott this week, and also in the South Grenville Beacon. It's also been on our website. Anyone who wishes to speak to the proposed amendment will be given the opportunity to do so tonight. And before you share comments, we ask that you just provide your name to the clerk, as our chair has mentioned. Your comments will be recorded in the meeting minutes and they do become part of the public record. Formal written comments are also accepted if you don't want to speak here tonight. Please address written comments to council, but send them to me through the community development coordinator. We ask that this be done as soon as possible, and that just gives staff and council the appropriate time to consider any feedback before the item comes before council for a decision. The committee members tonight may make a recommendation to council at the meeting, but this is not a meeting of council, and there will not be a decision made at tonight's meeting. Taking into consideration any comments here tonight, committee may also request that this amendment be brought to a future committee meeting for further discussion by its members, and may request that staff prepare a follow-up report or provide additional information at that meeting. If you do not make an oral presentation tonight or a written submission to the township before the bylaw is passed, you will not be entitled to appeal council's decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal. Additionally, you may not be added as a party to a hearing of an appeal before the Ontario Land Tribunal. A party to hearing meaning if there were a group of people that were going to appeal council's decision, you wouldn't be able to be added as a party to that hearing. Unless in the opinion of the tribunal, there are reasonable grounds to do so. If you'd like to receive a notice of council's decision following their decision, you need to make a written request for the township. This is done through myself, the community development coordinator. And without this written request, a notice of council's decision will not be mailed to you. So my email address, phone number, or you can make a mail a written request. All the information is on the public notice within this agenda package. Through the chair, number 5.
Yep, absolutely.
The agenda package includes a draft bylaw that outlines the changes that are proposed with this amendment. As mentioned earlier, this is a housekeeping amendment that is meant to correct minor errors, omissions, or provide clarification on the intent of the bylaw. It also amends provisions related to additional residential units and amends the schedules with respect to the floodplain delineation. A copy of the zoning bylaw text with track changes is included in the agenda package to show the proposed amendments within the bylaw. Our planner of record, which is NoTech, they prepared the bylaw and the amendment. They provided a report to summarize and explain the amendments. To go through some of the larger amendments. if it would be helpful to the committee.
Yeah, I think that might not be a bad idea, if you don't mind.
Okay, I want to talk first about additional residential unit policies. So the Planning Act was recently updated to allow up to 2 ARUs inside a principal dwelling where there are full municipal services, provided there isn't one already outside of the principal dwelling. Previously, we referred to these as second dwellings, like a separate second dwelling, a separate building, or second dwelling unit, like an apartment within the building. The Planning Act now says you can have up to 2 second dwelling units, like apartment style, within the main dwelling, as long as you don't have one in a separate dwelling already. So a slight difference, still no more than 3 units altogether per lot that you're entitled to, but 2 of them could be within the main dwelling, or 1 inside and 1 outside, and that's in areas that are serviced. So we've because the Planning Act requires us to allow this, we've updated it within this housekeeping amendment. We've also made some changes to the ARU provisions to make them a lot simpler to read. Before we had those terms second dwelling unit and we had second dwelling, and those were both different types of additional residential units. Now we're just going to call them additional residential units because it was kind of challenging to read all the different types of provisions and which one applies to which type of unit. They're just called ARUs. In our current zoning bylaw, you're not allowed to have an ARU that's larger than 50% of the size of the main dwelling, up to a maximum of 95 meters squared in the rural and agricultural zones. We've gotten rid of that limitation. So there isn't a limit to the size. You still have to comply with the rest of the provisions in the zoning bylaw, like lot coverage and all your setbacks. But we're not going to limit you to 50% of the size of the principal dwelling. And we're also not going to require that the additional residential unit is 6 meters or less from the principal dwelling. It will be further if you need it to be. We still require that it shares servicing with the principal dwelling. And that is a policy within our official plan. So we can't change that in our zoning bylaw without doing an official plan amendment. And that provision alone, I think, keeps the development to the smaller size, like having it secondary to the main dwelling without adding any provisions that we kind of felt were unnecessary. Secondary farm dwellings. When we adopted our zoning bylaw in 2022, we the previous one had allowed a secondary farm dwelling for help with, like, if a farmhand needed to move onto the property to help work on the farm. We would allow you to have a second dwelling. We removed those provisions because we were adding the provisions for additional residential units. Unintentionally, we made it more difficult to add a second dwelling for farm help because it had to share the same servicing, and then there's all those other size restrictions. So we've added back in those provisions for a secondary farm dwelling in the proposed amendments here. For vinyl and cloth accessory buildings, our previous zoning bylaw that was adopted in 2012 had restrictions on cloth buildings that we took out of the 2022 bylaw. It was our building department actually that asked us to add those back in with council's approval, of course. And so we've added it back in, slight change to the wording, but essentially it does the same thing. The vinyl and cloth buildings in that metal frame structure would not be permitted in the highway commercial zones or within the settlement areas, which is very similar to what was in the 2012 bylaw. Our building department felt that they pose a health and safety concern. They stay up for a lot longer than they should. They start to fall apart and they're not safe, and they've been having some challenges. So they asked us to consider adding those provisions back in.
Monday. Another question?
Oh, we'll get, there'll be a time for it for sure at the end.
I think maybe 2 more items I'll touch on are the changes to industrial zones. We had listed in the business park industrial and the general industrial zones. When you look at the list of permitted uses, it says that a retail store is permitted except when it's accessory to a warehouse or self-storage facility. And just the way it read on the list, storage facility was like on its own line down there. And we're like, oh, we need to just change the formatting a little bit so that it's all in one line. But as we were looking at this, we're like, why are we not allowing retail as an accessory to a warehouse or self-storage facility? If I have a self-storage facility and I want to sell some boxes with tape or something like that, like, could I not do that there? We're proposing that we take that exception out and allow the retail store if it's an accessory to a warehouse or self-storage facility, just like if it's an accessory to any other of the permitted uses that are in that zone. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is the floodplain hazard overlay zone. So our current bylaw has a floodplain overlay zone. We're gonna replace it with some more current mapping. The mapping that we used in the 2022 bylaw had been updated since then. It was in draft form when we started using it. As we were working with the bylaw and more specific properties, through consultation with South Nation, we found that our mapping differed from theirs. But we got our mapping from South Nation, so it prompted us to ask some more questions, and turned out when finalizing the floodplain mapping, there were some small changes made. And as a result, like the properties that we looked at, the floodplain was actually less, and they had more of a building envelope. So we adopted the new current floodplain mapping that we get from our conservation authority, but at the same time, the floodplain mapping we felt should include an allowance for wave uprush and other water-related hazards. The provincial policy statement requires us to take that into consideration. We don't allow development within those areas, including an allowance for wave uprush and other water-related hazards. The recommendation, if you don't have a site-specific study, in an area is 5 meters along the St. Lawrence to allow for wave uprush. The intent actually was to include that in the 2022 bylaw when it was adopted. If you look at even like our current bylaw has a definition of floodplain, and it says it's the 1 to 100 flood line with an allowance for wave uprush and flood. We thought that was included in our floodplain mapping, and we learned that it wasn't. So we've included that in the amendment. So after all that talking, I'm happy to help with any
Okay,
questions.
great, sounds good. So we'll open up to questions. When we do that, questions are directed to the chair, and then I'll make sure we refer to the right person. So are there any questions from members of the audience? So of the audience, I guess. Anybody, you had a question before, did you?
Yes. For the secondary farm.
Oh, sorry, can you just state your name again?
Sorry,
Sorry.
my name is Rob Hubel.
Perfect, thank you.
Address is 66 Empire Hannah Road.
Thank you, Rob.
Secondary farm dwellings. And I can't just refer to the act, so my apologies, but I can speak directly. Do they require to be linked to the septic, or is it a separate septic as well on the secondary farm?
Through the chair, I can
Yep.
respect that. No, does not require to share servicing. And I think that was one of the hurdles for someone who wanted to have a secondary farm dwelling is we were trying to apply the provisions of additional residential units to the farm dwellings where they just weren't necessarily meant for that. So.
Thank you.
Awesome, no problem, thank you. Yep.
Ray Hubel, Empire Hannah Road. Could you clarify what a 5 meter wave uprush hazard is?
To the chair, so the 5 meters for wave uprush and other water related hazards. So your floodplain, that boundary is based on an elevation of the property. And what that elevation is, it's different depending on where on the St. Lawrence River you are. But for water related hazards and wave uprush, we need to add an additional 5 meters inland from wherever that flood boundary is to allow for like large waves in a storm or things like that, because the water could push back. There's a definition of the provincial policy of wave uprush. I could probably can't find it, but I can bring it back to committee or council if you're.
Look at our email, it's on our email. It's very good.
Yes, yeah.
Okay,
So it's 5 meters from the existing line or 5 meters from the setback?
5 meters from the floodplain boundary is 5 meters from that elevation, that boundary line of the 1 to 100 year floodplain, and then 5 meters in, that's where our zoning bylaw is going to show the boundary. So people don't have to guess how far back they can build. It's easier to see your building envelope, and there's less surprises. If you were to look at our zoning bylaw and you see what the floodplain is, you assume you can build up to that point. you go to get a permit from the conservation authority, they know that they need to add that 5 meters, they like, and then it's more confusing, it's more steps, and it's more difficult for a developer. So I think having it clear in our zoning bylaw schedules, is easier for staff and for developers.
No, my question was because in 2019, we went to get a building permit to do just a renovation type thing. And the conservation said no, because your house is underwater. And the elevation of my house is well above the St. Lawrence River. But they would not come out, they would not allow me to take a picture and show it to them. And they wouldn't allow it type thing, so that's, I'm just curious whether that was part of their plan back then or something, so it was very odd, so they just didn't want to allow it at all. So, no problem, I'm just looking at it and saying, well, maybe that's why they disallowed it. Cool. Maybe I learned something today. So,
Thank you very much.
Through the chair,
Yep, no, we will have a section. I just want to make sure there's no other public questions first, and then we'll get to a community discussion. Sure. Okay. Any other questions?
All right, Counselor. Yeah, Chair. When you say no, you had an expression, no site-specific survey, then it's just a standard 5 meters back. Who would do, say you didn't want to develop, because the previous bylaws used to state that you only had to have was waterproofing. If you were in a floodplain, you could not have any openings below the floodplain. You had to be waterproof to there. That's obviously changed for good reasons. But who would do a site-specific study if you had to, or required to, or wanted to build closer?
Yes, for that as well.
Perfect.
Sure. So you could determine the floodplain boundary, that elevation, through a geodetic survey that does the elevations. But as far as what the actual wave uprush would be for your property, if you felt that it was likely less than 5 meters, an engineer should do that. And what type of engineer? I'm sorry, I don't know. Like there may be a big variety of different engineers that would feel they were qualified to determine that, but an engineer would need to determine what.
But it would start with a survey to determine where the elevations were on the property, and then you set your setbacks and create your envelope from there. Correct. So
I would leave it up to the qualified professional to determine that engineer, but sounds like a reasonable basis.
Right.
Contact them first, essentially. See what they say. Okay, any other questions from the public? No, all right.
No.
What?
So.
So I'll ask one more time, any other questions from the public on this consultation? Okay, good, all right, so now I'm trying to remember, it's been a while since we had one of these, but do I move just into the committee discussion now? Perfect, okay, all right, moving into the committee discussion, Deputy Mayor, I think you had your hand up already.
yes, thank you, do the chair. Is there, with the old one, to do an additional house or granny suite, whatever, we had to be 9 meters to share septic and well. Is that still in effect?
Through the chair, so those are, I think there's 2 different provisions that you're referring to. You did have to share septic and well.
Yeah.
You also couldn't be more than 6 meters.
Sorry,
from
6
the
meters.
principal dwelling. So you still have to share septic and well.
Yeah.
We don't care how close you are to the principal
Okay.
dwelling. You're gonna be pretty close because you need to share septic and well. but
Yeah.
We're not gonna measure.
But you're not gonna, the 6 meters. Thank you, that's a good one, thanks.
That's
Through the
right.
chair to Wendy, if you build the second dwelling on a house, on a property like the farm, does the septic tank have to be certain size to hold both properties?
Through the chair, if it was gonna be an additional residential unit and shared servicing, yes, you would have to have a permit from the Conservation Authority, who deals with variety of our building code, to make sure that that septic had the capacity for both units. If you're doing a second, like a farm dwelling, it doesn't have to share servicing, so if it's not gonna share servicing, it could have its own.
That's worked out. All right, well, I try not to ask questions as the chair, but I do have a few. So just on that last one with regards to the septic, would they if it wasn't the right size, would they be able to upsize that septic, redo the septic and then put the ARU in? Is that what you do, or is it existing septic?
To the chair, they could, install a new septic, or I don't know what would be involved in upgrading or expanding
yeah,
their
sure.
existing septic, but, you know, we would restrict them.
Okay, good. And then, we took care of that one there. For the retail warehouse, just you said we're removing that restriction so that they could have a facility. And that's a facility owned or operated by the business itself, or?
The chair, it would have to be accessory to use that's already permitted in that zone, the industrial zone or business park industrial zone.
Right, there's no chance somebody could turn, say, a storage facility and like one of these self-storage sites or something into a small little mini mall or something like that.
No, through the chair would have to be existing to, or accessory to the permitted use.
Okay, good. And that was all I had. Hold on, yeah, that was actually a question. So, okay, good, thank you. Any other questions from council? Okay, so on that, so we're not voting on this tonight, obviously, it sounds like in our council meeting next. Oh, there's a recommendation. Okay, let's see. Recommendation. The committee adopt the housekeeping amendment as attached.
The committee recommend that.
The committee recommended. Okay.
As attached, if you'd like to bring this up at the, sorry, at the next community development committee meeting.
Okay.
You could, direct staff to come back with more information. You can have a more fulsome discussion at the September 3rd community development committee.
And if committee decides, we can just send it off to council. It's not gonna be for tonight, it'll be for the end of September, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, on that note, any other comments you guys want to have about whether you'd like to just send this off to the next council meeting, or do you want to have some more information for next week's committee of the whole community development meeting? Councilor Smith,
We can wait for the committee development meeting.
you want to have more discussion on it?
Yeah.
Okay. Councilor Martel?
I'd be happy to move this now because I know that community development meeting's already gonna be jammed.
Good.
This here, what we're recommending is for CDCs, and it will become on the council at the end of September, is that right? It won't become the CDC next week.
Well, that's the question. So do you want to bring up more discussion at CDC next week, or would you like to just send it on to council?
No, I'm fine heading on the council myself.
Okay. And so Councilor Smith, is there anything else you want to add for discussion that you're worried about, or no? No. Okay, so I guess it sounds like the recommendation that we're looking to adopt is the committee recommend that council adopt the housekeeping amendment as attached. All in favor? You don't need to move it a second, right? Yeah, moved by Councilor Bartel, seconded by Councilor Smith. Sorry about that. It's been a while since we had one of these meetings. All right, all in favor? Okay, unanimous. Okay, so that's good. So we'll see that at the end of September as a council motion, and there we are. So with that, that brings us to adjournment. For the next steps, are the next council meeting is scheduled September 23rd, and you'll see this there. And so once a decision is made by council and a notice of decision is prepared, there will be a 20-day appeal period. As a reminder, if you wish to be notified of council's decision, you must make a written request to the township through the community development coordinator, and that way you'll be able to get an email, I guess it is, when this is all done, and we'll take care of that. Is there anything that I've missed? I don't believe so. So, yeah, so I guess that's it. Moving for adjournment then, right? So who would like to make a motion for adjournment? Moved by Councilor Martel and seconded by Councilor Smale. All in favor? All right, good. All right.